I really think that the future of the workplace is going to be more human, no matter how much we talk about AI. And therefore, the focus on EX really needs to be front and center. And that means that, at least from me as an HR practitioner, I feel like we will not get to that future state just by doing what we have done so far. So we need to bring in different expertise into this. If we really need to build the future workplace, then it is not just HR doing this. It's going to be a whole team effort with very different skill sets at play.
You're listening to the Trust Builders podcast, brought to you by Adoreboard.
Hello and welcome to today's Trust Builders. So I'm really thrilled today's session is going to be taking a shift into the world of employee experience. And we've got a fantastic guest speaker today. And we're going to introduce her in a second. But today is really going to be looking at employee experience at scale. We're going to be getting some insights into an organization that has last reported $8.5 billion turnover, operates in 60 countries, and has 25,000 full-time employees, and I believe a further 15 to 20 additional employees as well. So you're very welcome, Catalina. So do you want to introduce yourself, and I'll allow Alex to say hello as well.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And it's lovely to be here. Thanks for the invite. So I am Kathakali. I know that sounds a mouthful. So a lot of my European counterparts, American counterparts refer to me as Katha. That's what I'm usually known as. I have been leading employee listening. I have been part of LSEG, which is London Stock Exchange Group, since May 2023. I've been leading it now for a couple of months. And prior to that, of course, I was also doing a bit of work around employee listening in Capgemini, where I spent about 7.5 years in varying different roles. And prior to Cap, I was also with a manufacturing firm for a little over 5.5 years. And I think we can deep dive into what we did in each of those areas. But yeah, that's a brief overview of what I've been doing.
So today we're going to be focusing on key takeaways, really thinking about how do you set up an employee experience program. Everything from data collection to identifying your business champions to drive action, how that's been done at London Stock Exchange, and then thinking about employee listening as a cultural temperature check, and then how can you think about co-creation from an employee experience. So maybe just to jump straight in, human resources was an unexpected, unintended career path for you. You maybe just help me understand. You started in manufacturing with really hands-on experience at an operational level. How did you journey into employee experience?
So even if I go back to my post-grad days as well, Chris, I didn't think that I would be in HR. In fact, I thought I would be more on the communication side, probably get into marketing as well, because I think that's where my interests were. And so I almost made an accidental shift into HR. And then I started with my first exposure in a manufacturing company. And I think that was tremendously useful because I feel you learn HR really well in a manufacturing setup. For me, it was also the fact that this was a small firm which was not mass producing steel, but actually preparing products required in critical steel applications. So basically, each of your customer products look different from the next. So the ask is very different, right? So it was very customized, and therefore even the operating model was also very different. We didn't even have something like HR in place. So I actually was working alongside a team and an external consultant from a company called Larsen and Toubro, which is a huge company, which is again a huge company in India in manufacturing, who actually helped us design and develop and implement programs from the ground up. So that's where the majority of my learning happened. And I thoroughly enjoyed it because I did it for almost 5.5 years, at which point I was thinking, what's next? And that's when I moved into Capgemini, but I moved in a very different space. I basically got into a role in HR operations, which is very different from a generalist sort of or a business partner sort of a role. It's more on the back end side of things, right? So I did that for a while, probably a little over 1.5 years. And after which I again moved around and got into talent management, which was again a very interesting space because we did a lot of Like I was leading the work there on overhauling the whole competency framework. So we were bringing in cybersecurity roles, etc., which didn't exist in the framework back then. So that was super interesting. But then by that time, I had reached a point where I was thinking like I've done everything in HR. So whether it's recruitment, performance management, OD, exits. And I was almost a bit frustrated also with how we were doing HR because I was thinking that probably we are missing something here. And that's when the employee listening role actually came, and I had no idea what employee listening entailed, what it meant to actually create an organization that was really focused on the human first. And so this was almost like on a fluke or a chance opportunity for me that I just took on, and because I just wanted to explore something. And that's how I ended up in listening. And I think this has been my longest role so far. I've spent almost a little over 3 years now because I've just enjoyed doing this role so much, and there's no scope for me to get bored in this space, and there's just a lot of opportunity to do new things as well. So yeah, that's how I ended up in employee listening, and then of course the EX space specifically.
Superb. Alex, I don't know if I've asked you the same question. How did you end up in CX? I picture you as a university professor if you hadn't taken the role at Zappos. So maybe you could, I suppose, compare notes there in terms of accidental turns and twists in terms of careers.
I think these are the best twists and turns, right? The accidental ones. You're right. I think my background is in experimental social psychology, and as a foreign student in the US, I had to continue to study for as long as I could to keep my visa status current. And the natural progression would have been to become a professor, but I was so sick and tired of being poor for all this time. So I decided to back in the day when online job search was a very new thing. I started putting in the keyword psychology, and the ability roles started coming up. So that's turned out to be a very practical application of what I had been studying in graduate school.
Super.
And so yeah, my foray into the business world was through the field of usability and then broader customer experience.
Superb. And I suppose one of the joint passions is the phrase that was used there around human first, right? So, and I know we've talked about Zappos being a really fantastic example. Maybe just quick reflections. We talked about favorite books in our pre-chat and how that is influenced yourself. Do you want to maybe throw out one or two that have really had an impact? And maybe start with you, Kath.
Yeah, so one of my favorite books, probably, and I don't think this is probably it's also very closely linked to EX, is Man's Search for Meaning by Dr. Viktor Frankl. I read this book when I was very young, and it definitely influenced my thinking around what I wanted to do in life, where I wanted to go, and therefore also how I approach my work. So that's been a book that has influenced me a lot. There's another book that I actually recently read. This is Shoe Dog by Phil Knight, which I also found super inspiring. And again, a very human book. While he talks about his entrepreneurial journey and all the ups and the downs, he is also able to weave a story around how important it is to focus on the relationship aspect of it, and that your relationships are building the business and therefore everything else that follows. So I found that book also a big influence. It's been probably, I read it very recently, but it's definitely gone into one of my top favorites for sure.
Fantastic. And I suppose if we're to maybe just take a quick side turn into thinking about employee listening programs and how should we be thinking about creating those in our organizations. You've three elements that you've talked about in terms of effective employee listening, clarity of purpose, user-friendly data collection, and then the presence of business champions to drive action. And we also talked about how do you the shift of HR, particularly in technology companies, to almost being the chief happiness officer. It's all about employee well-being as opposed to the traditional HR, which was very policy driven. Can you maybe just give us an introduction into how do we think about employee listening programs? How do we go about setting those up? And then we talked about leadership being really critical as part of that. Maybe your reflections on that.
Yeah, so I think for me again it goes back to the question of why we are doing employee listening, because it's not just, I think that is something we have to be very clear on, that what is the purpose behind me asking for feedback. Because if you're asking people for feedback, it just means that we have to do something with it, and it has to drive at an objective for the employees, so, and also therefore for the business. So I think the why needs to be very clear on what we want to do and why we want to do it, number one. Number two would also be in terms of getting leadership buy-in. That's critical as well, because you might want to do all the listening programs in the world and send out all kinds of surveys to your people. But if your leadership is not bought into why you are doing it or how it can improve what they are trying to accomplish in the business, then it will all fall flat. So I think that's another very critical element for a listening program to work well. And the third aspect, obviously, is action taking, which is what you do with the feedback once it comes in. But I also know this is not just this organization that I'm part of. It's practically every organization out there that struggles a bit with action taking, because you have leaders who are doing n number of things and are being pulled in several directions. So how do you get them to focus their energy also on what their people are telling them and therefore what they need to improve? So I think these three things for me are the key pillars for having a very sound and a solid employee listening program.
That's fantastic. And I suppose, Alex, the shift from traditional approaches to employee listening to this more dynamic understanding of organizational culture. What's your thoughts on how modern organizations, particularly post-COVID, they're actually having to redefine their value proposition from an employee experience perspective? From what you've heard there, what do you think are the key considerations that we need to reflect on?
I mean, if I have to pick one, Chris, I'd say taking action is really where the rubber meets the road, and that really is what makes it real. Because sometimes if you do the listening part and collecting the data without acting, it actually is worse than the not listening, right? And because you're setting this false expectation and then you're not delivering on it. So I think that's the crux of any company culture, is how do you invest your resources? And if you invest your resources in making changes, then it's real. If not, it's just words.
And I suppose some of the practical examples that we talked about in terms of how London Stock Exchange does that, but also reflecting on your experience at Capgemini. We talked about things that were done pre-COVID and post-COVID, and maybe just get some examples of how that action has transpired into improving employee engagement.
Yeah, I think with Capgemini, when I was there, I don't think when COVID hit us and it just completely hit us all out of the blue, right? We were not prepared. Nobody was prepared for it. So there was obviously no listening program, nothing on the ground that was capturing information. So this actually predates me. This was probably when I was not even part of the listening team, but the listening team was already designing surveys, and they were pushing out surveys to employees at scale to get their feedback on how are they feeling, what is going on in terms of what do they need help with during times of COVID. And I think that actually helped a lot of the on-ground work that happened, and how business partners were actually able to take all of that information and then kind of work with the employees to get them what they needed. And to be honest, India was struggling. We had a very bad phase as well, the second or the third phase, second phase probably, which was quite rough for the country overall. I think as an organization, Capgemini did an amazing job of pivoting very quickly and getting all of that, capturing that information from the employees and getting that into the hands of the business partners and the right HR folks who could then just look at the feedback and run with it and actually create some momentum on the ground. So I think that was pretty amazing to be able to do that at scale for almost 350,000 employees.
That's phenomenal. And I think just to pick up on your reflection on action, you very much think about action as co-created solutions, right? Where feedback is informing that. Could you maybe just talk us through that in terms of top down to bottom up approach in terms of some of your reflections on that?
Yeah, so one of the things, obviously, when it comes to listening, is we always think that okay, it's the people leaders who are going to drive actions off the back of it, and well, that's true. But I also firmly believe in having a bottom-up approach, wherein we also put the results in the hands of, let's say, our employees to then understand what needs to shape and how they can be a part of the solution, how they can co-create those solutions. But I don't think LSEG is at a point yet where we are still doing that. I think for us right now, we are still very focused on how our people leaders are going to take the results and then what are they going to do out of it. I've been having some conversations with some of our data and analytics leaders who are keen on doing a model where we capture the feedback, but then we sit with our employees and have focus group conversations and more deep dive conversations to understand, okay, this is what you're telling us, and this is what we are thinking of doing. Do you think we are going in the right direction? And therefore, if we are not, can you help us co-create? But this is again at a very, very nascent stage, I would say, because again, this also requires a heavy amount of time, energy, investment as well, because you really need to, co-creation means that you really need to get all your stakeholders along. So I wouldn't say that we are very matured in doing this. We are still very much in the early stages, but I firmly believe that that's the right direction to go in when it comes to working with the feedback.
Fantastic. And I suppose we talked about the CEO of London Stock Exchange and thinking about actually the employee listening program being led from the top, where it's vision led, underpinned by values, and then the employee listening program is almost like the culture check around that. Could you just outline how you guys have gone about approaching that very much focus from a leadership perspective and why that's so important to then underpin that with values and then thinking about how you measure those values through your employee listening program?
Yeah, so I think LSEG underwent a whole values work, which was probably the time when I joined. This was 2023, probably mid 2023 onwards. So our values are integrity, partnership, excellence, and change. These are the 4 values that we stand for. Our listening programs, so when I joined, of course, because we were doing all of that work and we were kind of cascading it throughout the organization, therefore, our listening programs had to pivot and make sure that we were capturing and we were underpinning the questions we were asking in a way that was capturing that as well. So, for example, like we were talking about bringing employees back to work, right? So this is when the hybrid policy was already in force, and then we wanted to get more employees back in the office. So we had to frame a question wherein we were asking the question in a way that, are you aware of that you have to be in office, and then this is important. So you have to frame the question in a certain way that it didn't seem offensive to the employees, but at the same time it kind of nudged them to think that okay, I probably this is important to be in office a certain number of days, etc. So that was a question that I think this was probably introduced, I think 2 years back, the hybrid question in one of the surveys. So this was one of the examples, or probably one of the ways that we were looking at underpinning and rather probably framing and structuring our listening surveys in a way that was aligning with what the organization really needed at that point in time and what the business direction or the strategic direction for the organization was.
I suppose, Alex, from your perspective, we often talk about measuring trust in the service, and I'm wondering your reflection on customer experience in terms of that. One question, whether that might spark a bit of a discussion about how do we actually start to think about measuring trust in organizations.
Yeah, great question, Chris. I mean, the question that I've been using for the past few years is one that, the way I remember it, I heard from Fred Reichheld, which he developed alongside with the Net Promoter Score, but didn't publicize it or market it as well. But I still believe it's a really brilliant question or statement, and it literally states the organization. So for customers, we would say organization X, let's say, always has my best interest as a customer in mind. So that's the customer perspective. From an employee perspective, it would be phrased, our organization always has my best interest as an employee in mind. And what I like about this is, I mean, it is a very high bar, but I think what it underscores is the need for balance, and a balance between looking out for the interest of the organization and looking out for the interest of the individual employee. And the question is, where do you fall on that balance, right? Because if you take this idea of getting back to the office, you can go with a mandate, and then it may look like it's all because the organization benefits, right? If there's no trust, that would be the implication. But if you listen and you understand the employee perspective, then providing a balance, I think, is, and when you're transparent, then I think everybody is gonna be on board.
And maybe this comes back to the co-creation point that we talked about earlier. Is this in terms of thinking about building trust? Is there additional points to be made there in terms of connecting the survey results to processing that as a co-created input to a leadership decision? And maybe the example that you've outlined with the COVID is a really fantastic example. Is there any other points to build on there in terms of how you can build trust within the organization?
I think one of the things that I have seen since I've joined LSEG is barriers to execution is one thing that comes up quite a bit as a point or as a driver that we need to focus on. So there's been a lot of work that's been done by the different teams to drive that. So it's I wouldn't say that it has drastically improved, but it has definitely improved from how it was before, because there's also been a lot of communication around, let's say, you said this and we did this, therefore. So those kind of even if they are not like going out every quarter or every month whatsoever, there is a sort of visibility around this is what you have told us, and this is what we have done with it. So that's something that I've seen quite a bit, especially in this barriers to execution space, because it used to come up quite a bit. Probably not as much now because it has improved quite a bit, but it used to be something that was a huge focus area for the organization. So there were quite a few number of actions that actually came off the back of that feedback as well, that we were able to, probably the organization and different parts of the organization was able to work on and therefore improve.
Superb. And I love that idea of being very transparent. You're asking your employees to tell us how you feel, and the organization in the next survey is asking the same question without any kind of accountability around processing what they've said, and here's the action that we've taken. So I love that as an example, and I'm sure the marketeers in your organization love that as well from an internal comms. That creates a wonderful way to celebrate some of the successes in your organization. We talked about marketing before and the role of HR as internal comms and celebrating those moments that matter. Could we maybe just delve into that? Is the HR role really internal marketing?
So we have a fantastic communications team, Chris, at LSEG. So I work pretty closely with them in terms whenever these surveys come around, whether it's prior to the survey launch, during and after. So they do a lot of that heavy lifting around the communication and cascading all of that as well. So I feel that really brings all of it to life. So while they are after us to find out what have we done with the survey, we are then after, when we work with the comms team to say, okay, this is what we have done, how do we share it further with our audience so that it lands really well. So I think working with these teams, these cross-functional teams, becomes very critical, because that's what I feel like when you're trying to create a fantastic employee experience. It's not just about HR. You are working with a lot of different teams. You're working with IT, you're working with facilities, or because it could be about the workspace, it could be about the communications team that's cascading all of this information. So I think when it comes to EX, and especially what I feel when it comes to the employee feedback, it's really a cross-functional effort. It's not something that's just sitting with HR and HR is expected to do something with the feedback. It takes a tribe to get all of this to work. So I feel that EX is really in that space where we are leveraging a lot of expertise across the business to make things work and to have an impact.
Super. And I love that idea that what is the barrier often with the actionability is the silos. And maybe Alex, you could reflect on your experience in Zappos. I know they co-created in wonderful ways in terms of getting employee impact, but that was really underpinned by CEO principles. Could you maybe just talk through how those principles really inform the environment in which organization kind of sets the standards and accountability for employees?
Sure thing, Chris. Yeah, I mean, the caveat here is that this was the culture created by Tony Hsieh, right? And in the early days, and So of course everything changes, and that's change is the only constant. So now things are a little bit different. So my comments will have to do with around the time when I joined Zappos about 10 years ago. And this was, you're absolutely right. I think one of the biggest learnings for me was how the culture was created, and it was co-created really. And it was involved everyone, and it was very intentional. And it was created by getting feedback, listening to employees, and then shaping those pieces of feedback into principles, back and forth a few rounds, right, until you get to the 10 core values. That it was there was a very extensive document where you would state the value, but also then you would explain what it means and what it means to put it in action, and what it means for everyone to really act on it. And the main point was that it's everybody's responsibility to keep the culture alive and to put it in practice, really. So that to me is the biggest lesson in culture building, really.
Sure thing. And it's some of those principles are quite could get the odd chuckle, bring your full self to work, bring a bit of weirdness, but also the fact that we don't want you stay in the organization if you aren't happy. Maybe those two small examples, your experience of that, where you've seen, how they, I suppose, empower their employees to engage really fully with their customers.
Are you asking me for an example?
Yeah, that would be amazing, Alex. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, I mean, putting it in practice was, well, first of all, nobody had an office, right? And it was really the executives went out of their way to say we're not anything special, right? We don't have offices and that sort of thing. And then really to put everybody close to the customer, we had this ritual every year. Everybody got on the phones and listened to customer calls, for example, because customer service was at the core of that culture. That was the engine, right? And so it's these little things, right, where leaders really model that behavior, that when things really become real.
Fantastic. And Kathakali, I would love to maybe pivot to the whole notion of AI. It's obviously on everyone's lips at the moment. We had a really interesting discussion thinking about what does that mean for employee skills going into the future. And we talked about actually some of the softer skills now becoming into focus. I would love to get your take on how AI is changing how employees do their job. Obviously, London Stock Exchange, big focus on engineering. But I would love to get the two-sided coin on that in terms of the productivity, but also what you're seeing in terms of bringing into focus some further skills that are probably non-AI related. I'd love to get your
Yeah. Yeah, sure, Chris. So LSEG is highly focused on AI because we have our chief information officer. He focuses and he's the one who's driving the whole engineering mandate, right? So the engineering team is superbly talented and they are all very much interested in AI. We have a lot of AI communities at LSEG where in fact people are developing their own platforms even, and they are allowed to experiment within the remits of what we are allowed to do and not. I think it's also true for the team that I am currently part of. So employee listening currently sits under the data and analytics space. So there is a lot of focus on AI. But one thing that I do observe now more than ever is I don't think that we are chasing AI as a shiny object. We don't have the shiny object syndrome. I think it's more about, so for example, right now we are focusing very heavily on data governance. So getting the fundamentals right, because it's almost like if you feed shit in, you'll get shit out. So if you're not feeding in the right data, your AI is not going to work. So I see a huge focus on data governance that I probably may not have seen a couple of years ago. I think that's happening because AI is coming more into the picture, because if you really need that to work, you need to get this fundamental sorted. So That's one thing that I observe quite a bit. And also, along with that, what I also feel is that even going further into the future, a couple of years down the line, while we can argue that AI is going to reshape our, and I don't believe in that AI will take away the job completely. It will reshape the work that you do, right? So you will actually able to leverage it better. So more of the human skills, right? The higher cognitive human skills, like for example, your creativity, communication, curiosity, compassion, all of that collaboration. I think these skills, which we probably may have always referred to as soft skills, will become even more important. So more of that human skills that will come into play, and that will become even more important, especially because you are going to be freed up from doing, let's say, the monotonous or the repetitive job, which anyway humans don't like to do. We don't like to do boring work. We like to be creative. So it can open up, I potentially think there's the scope to open up this massive playing field for us to really operate at a very high level, even as a species, is what I think about it as.
Fantastic. And I suppose, Alex, you'll reflect on the mad gold rush for big data when that was the thing, and now obviously AI is the new buzzword. You often talk about kind of bringing it back to thinking about employees and customers as people, not just as number. I suppose that resonates with you, the rare skill of human to human. Who knew that would be the really important thing? I suppose just to get your thoughts on that and how you see that play out in today's organizations.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said, Kathakali. Yeah, I mean, it is really the balance again between focusing on numbers, and the trap that we shouldn't fall into is this belief that what works in physical science is going to work in human sciences, right? When it comes to humans, because numbers is all you need when it comes to physics and all these engineering, right? You don't need to worry about how the bricks feel when you lay them and when you line them up. But to take that mindset and to apply it to areas where you deal with humans, it's a big mistake, because what we know from behavioral economics, for example, is economics is based on the assumption that humans act as mathematicians and nobody acts as a mathematician. So the same applies with data science and with algorithms and with AI now, is who is, when they build the algorithms, who is allowing for that, right? Are you building the algorithms based on the assumption that we're completely rational and we move according to physical laws only? And that's one of the going back to the books, is one of my favorite books recently has been Rory Sutherland's Alchemy, and he talks about how humans are not that rational and how we need to embrace that and embrace the magic, essentially, right? And I think that's what separates us from AI ultimately.
Yeah, I love Kathakali's point around this idea of data governance, which is experiment and we use it from a creativity point of view, but also think about what are the boundaries, what are the actual ways in which it can be applied in organizations. Maybe just as we're kind of concluding, maybe just to sum up what I love about our discussion was really the journey of thinking about the successful implementation of employee experience. We talked about having a clear purpose, thinking about a user-friendly data collection, ensuring that you have your business champions set out, and really fantastic to hear the reflections on London Stock Exchange. We talked about leveraging AI by also prioritizing data governance. So it just maybe just to get some further reflections, just as we sum up, also wonderful to have you on the Trust Builders Kathakali. So over to you for summing up and key takeaways.
Yeah, so I really think that the future of the workplace is going to be more human, no matter how much we talk about AI. And therefore the focus on EX really needs to be front and center. And that means that, at least from me as an HR practitioner, I feel like we will not get to that future state just by doing what we have done so far. So we need to bring in different expertise into this. So we probably need folks with UX, UI design skills. We need people who have done service design, product design, people who have worked in, let's say, with agile methodology. So these are all very different skill sets, probably not native to HR. And therefore, we need to, if we really need to build the future workplace, then it is not just HR doing this. It's going to be a whole team effort with very different skill sets at play. And at the same time, I think we also need to be cognizant of the fact that there are different generations that are already joining the workforce. So they will have different expectations. They are used to different experiences outside of work. So even when we talk about the consumer grade experiences that they have with, let's say, an Amazon, like you have stuff at the click of a button on an app. Our workplaces need to be able to create an environment that's probably as attractive, if not more. And that's going to become even more important. So I think, therefore, if you keep that end state and future state in mind, it's really going to, we are really going to need a lot of different skill sets at play here to build that for the future.
Superb. And I think it kind of reflects some of the research we were talking about before, I think produced by Kennedy Finch, which talked about this idea of humanized growth. Maybe that's just a final point to end on in terms of your thoughts around the importance of putting a people first approach in a growth trajectory and trying to get that balance of what Alex is talking about in terms of organizational benefit with obviously growing your employees' talents and ensuring they contribute. So maybe a quick summing up there as well.
Yeah, I think that's critical because your numbers, your profits, and all of those, the metrics don't come from anywhere else but from your people. So if it's pretty basic and it's common sense that if you take care of your people right and you do the right things and you create that environment for them to thrive and flourish, your numbers are going to follow. And I think that's something that probably Alex would agree with because Zappos had created that sort of a culture, especially when Tony Hsieh was leading it. And of course, got subsequently acquired by Amazon. But there have been some organizations that have done they have been able to do that incredibly well. And also, I think there's something to be said about leadership as well. So if you've read books like Jim Collins is Good to Great, where he talks about level 5 leadership being extremely impactful in creating those market leading organizations that consistently outperform the market. I think that has a significant role to play and ties in again into what we are trying to do in the X space and therefore the buy-in, etc. So yeah, I completely agree with that, Chris.
Superb. And Alex, any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, Chris, this is a great summing up by Kathakali. Thank you so much. This was a great discussion.
Kathakali, thank you so much for your time and Trust Builders. You've been a phenomenal guest, and thank you so much for the practical takeaways that you've offered for our employee experience listeners, and also the idea of building trust within an organization by putting the humanized focus on growth at the center of what we do. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in for another episode of Trust Builders. Thanks again. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Trust Builders podcast, brought to you by Adoreboard.